Themis mythology. Section 5.1. Writing Gaia Themis into Western civilization. Zeus, as previously mentioned, is often credited in archetypal psychology as the father of culture. Certainly there is some truth to this, but his is the patriarchal autocratic culture that refuses to follow the rhizome out and unfold in new directions. Autocracy is the enemy of adaptation, or as Hollis suggests, innovation, personified by Prometheus, is the enemy of tyrants within the larger arc of paranoid patriarchy, which he ascribes to Chronos Saturn, not just Zeus. Where there is Gaia, the Zeus order, it would appear, seeks to eradicate or engineer and mass produce her wherever and whenever possible, despite Hollywood's warnings of material upheaval, or material upheaval. Turning to the Themis side of the hyphen, an old adage goes, quote, behind every great man there's a woman rolling her eyes, unquote. Zeus needs to be reminded of his place in the larger, connected scheme of things. He needs a human rights activist like Prometheus and all the puerile and psychopathic baggage that he brings. His or her pathology has been birthed and blessed by Gaia Themis. Revising the historical and mythological narrative, often blurred, he owes all to Themis' connected, just social order, correctly constructed upon a foundation in the maternal feminine. 5.2. Themis and the collective. Lest this investigation fall into goddess worship, Themis, as with all her Titan brethren, has her inflations. She is, after all, Hollywood's classic queen of the high-tech hive or hatchery, reminding us of the insidious side of the collective. Historically, she is likewise a Madonna of conservative Marianismo, the cultural transmission model of teaching that deprives students of nourishing autonomy. Mother who knows best, ensuring that they absorb our cultural legacies, unquote. This is from Buell. Perhaps it is Prometheus, the wily one, the archetypal innovator, who challenges the cultural system, feeding with new challenges and directions. In any case, this devouring monstrous mother metaphor in cultural perspective merits closer critical examination, because it speaks to a misogynistic and problematic polarity in Jungian studies between the individual and the collective, as will be pointed out in more detail further on, and also represented in the photo you see here. This comes from Jung's retreat called Bollingen. Some commentary that is relevant to this discussion comes from Henderson, who describes what he calls the social attitude, which is, quote, concerned with maintaining the ethical code of the culture, whether the established culture or any specific countercultural deviation from it, unquote. According to Henderson, the social attitude in analytical psychology has been equated with the Gnostic anthropos archetype, which at worst represented, quote, the collective monster, unquote, of the state. At best, it connotes a structured shared power harmonium of the people, the crown, and the state. Henderson evokes here the classic tension between autonomy and homonymy, the good of the individual versus the good of the group. Henderson depicts the polemic thusly, quote, if one becomes too individualistic, the effect is psychic inflation and isolation from one's fellow man. If one lives too collectively, one becomes uncomfortably deflated and subtly depressed, unquote. In the classic Jungian sense, there's no mistaking the alleged role of the feminine, or in men the anima, in driving the sort of collective complex just described, and its particular sort of depression. This is not far removed from the monstrous mother archetype in Jung's portrayal of the individuation journey. She and her unconscious goo constitute a quote-unquote whale dragon that the hero must slay. A full appraisal of women's individuation, or heroine's journey, was not within Jung's purview. In the classic mythological sense, we know the hero to be a white male and all the monsters to be manifestations of the feminine. Ideologically speaking, there is, of course, Mother Russia. Among the various products of his stonecraft that adorn Bollingen, there is a depiction of a bear rolling a ball. You can see her here, upon which Jung inscribed in Latin, "The she-bear moves the mass." In her interactions with Joris Horney, Bollingen's curator, Cooper White informs us that Jung had two explanations for his depiction. The first was that this represented Ursa Major, the Big Dipper, thought by the ancients to maintain the steady roll of the world among the heavens. The second sense of the she-bear centered on the Russian, the second sense of the bear centered on the Russian sense of she-bear, rolling Marxist manipulation into the world. What a curious split of the mother archetype. In one of his last writings before dying, the Freudian analyst Winnicott discoursed upon both Jung's and his own dissociative disorders, which he blamed on allegedly inadequate mothers. Roy, citing his own capacity to contain the savage feminine imbued in the goddess of his region of India, Druga, makes the case that one must earn credibility by distancing ourselves from the draw of archetypes in the domain of the collective. Question, in other words, the, quote, personal equation of the observer, unquote. The cultural complex of interest in American society for Roy is the particular Judeo-Christian complex carried to its shores by the Puritans, with their own extreme polarity, it is alleged, between the striving for perfection versus wholeness, one characterized by a prudishly judgmental stance and blindness to one's own quote-unquote power shadow. Control of self and others, self-righteous arrogance and shadow projection, he alleges, served to sustain, quote, the illusion of perfection, unquote. 5.3 Gothic Themis. Armed with the aforementioned discoveries, the detective spirals back around to the Gothic. Rowland finds the roots of Jung's ghostly Gothic feminine projection in Jung's mother, who, in addition to being institutionalized, was an avid spiritualist. According to Rowland's quote, she possessed a conventional, everyday personality behind which a ghostly secondary number two identity had its being. This also brings us back to the she-bear, the double nature of the she-bear, Ursa Major. According to Rowland, this split fed Jung's dedication to science during the day and religion at night. Somewhere between Winnicott's and Rowland's critiques, it's reasonable to assume that Jung's ultimate other was none other than the Great Mother. Perhaps Prometheus bound for the whole of patriarchy-driven Western civilization may be constituted as her first knock at the door. A focused review of the classical roots of the Prometheus legend reveals a compelling feminist counter-narrative to the patriarchal reign of Zeus as father of culture. It confirms our suspicion that the trail of Themis need not end with Jung's mother complex. Karenyi, for example, suggests growing skepticism with regard to the reign of Zeus in classical Athens around the time that Aeschylus produced the Prometheus cycle. This is pointed out earlier. Athenians, literally of Athena, goddess of the polis. Between the methemes of Athena and her forerunner Themis, the scales of justice and civic harmony were conveyed from Mount Olympus to nearly every city center across the Western world. In challenging the Zeus order, Athenian democracy, blind to its subjugation of women and enslavement of minorities, ultimately failed to incorporate the promise rooted in its own subconscious, as constituted in the Themis mytheme. This is a failure that remains to be fully addressed in the Western world, arguably.